Winter in the Bitterroot mountain range doesn't just arrive, it swallows the world whole. For 59-year-old Abigail Foster, surviving the impending whiteout meant defying nature itself. She spent November digging a 150-foot trench, linking her front door to her livestock. Locals called her crazy. Then, the sky broke open. Abigail Foster's property sat at the end of a long, unforgiving dirt road, 20 miles outside of Darby, Montana. It was a beautiful, jagged piece of the American West, dominated by towering lodgepole pines and the looming, jagged granite teeth of the Bitterroot Mountains. For 3 decades, she and her husband, Thomas, had worked this land. Thomas had been a structural engineer for the county, a man who measured his life in load-bearing capacities and sheer strength. But Thomas had passed away from a sudden coronary 3 years prior, leaving Abigail alone with 20 acres, a flock of Rhode Island red chickens, 3 alpine goats, and a stubborn, aging draft mule named Samson. The isolation was a choice, but as November of 2008 approached, it began to feel like a trap. Abigail was a retired high school biology teacher, a woman of science and observation. She paid attention to the natural world. The squirrels had developed unusually thick coats by late September. The yellow jackets had built their nests high in the eaves of her porch, far above the ground. A piece of folk wisdom her grandfather swore by, indicating deep snow was coming. More importantly, the NOAA weather radio that crackled on her kitchen counter had been issuing long-range forecasts of an anomaly. A brutal La Niña system was pulling immense moisture from the Pacific and slamming it directly into a stationary, bone-chilling Arctic high descending from Canada. Abigail remembered the winter of '96. She and Thomas had been trapped in the cabin for 5 days. They had nearly lost their small herd because they physically could not push through the 7-foot drifts to reach the barn, which sat exactly 150 feet from the cabin's back door. Thomas had eventually tied a climbing rope to his waist and tunneled his way there, returning frostbitten and exhausted. This year, Abigail was alone. If the snow piled up like the radio predicted, she wouldn't just lose the animals, she might freeze trying to save them. On November 2nd, the frost line had not yet set into the Montana soil. Abigail drove her battered Ford F250 into town and rented a Kubota KX018 mini excavator from a local equipment yard. The idea was audacious, born of pragmatism and a healthy dose of fear. She was going to connect the cabin to the barn. The physical toll was immediate. Over the next 12 days, Abigail operated the heavy machinery from dawn until dusk. She carved a trench 4 feet wide and roughly 3 feet deep into the hard-packed earth, cutting a direct, perfectly straight line across the yard. Her hands, already knotted with early-stage arthritis, cramped agonizingly around the joysticks of the excavator. She popped ibuprofen like candy and drank thermos after thermos of black coffee, driven by the ticking clock of the changing season. Once the trench was dug, the real engineering began. Drawing on the notebooks Thomas had left behind in his workshop, she framed the interior of the trench with pressure-treated 4x4 posts, spaced precisely 32 inches apart. She secured them with structural screws using a heavy-duty impact driver, the mechanical clack, 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 echoing off the silent observing pines. She then spanned the top with 2x6 joists. On top of the joists, she laid 1/2-inch CDX plywood, covering that with heavy-duty EPDM rubber pond liner she had ordered in bulk. Finally, she topped the structure with salvaged corrugated steel roofing panels, angled slightly to shed water before the freeze. To insulate the makeshift tunnel, she used the excavator to carefully backfill 2 feet of the excavated dirt over the top of the steel. From the surface, it looked as though a giant mole had burrowed a raised mound straight across her property. From the inside, it was a dark, claustrophobic passageway, measuring 5.5 feet high from the trench floor to the ceiling joists. Abigail, standing at 5'4", could walk it without bending her neck. On day 10 of the build, her nearest neighbor, a 65-year-old retired logger named Warren Hayes, drove up her driveway in his rusted Dodge. He leaned against the doorframe of his truck, pushing back his heavily stained Carhartt cap, and stared at the mound of earth bisecting her yard. "Abby," Warren drawled, his breath pluming in the crisp 20-degree air. "I knew Thomas liked his projects, but what in the hell are you building? A bunker?" Abigail wiped a smear of dirt from her forehead, adjusting her work gloves. "A walkway, Warren. The Farmer's Almanac and the Weather Service are both screaming about a historic drop. I'm not losing Samson or the goats because I can't walk across the yard." Warren chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "It's Montana, Abby. It snows. We plow. You're working yourself into an early grave over a weather report. You need anything from the feed store? I'm heading down tomorrow." "No, Warren, I'm stocked. Just make sure your own generator is running." Warren waved her off, climbing back into his truck. "You watch too much news, Abby." Abigail watched his taillights fade down the dirt road. She didn't feel crazy. She felt a cold, creeping certainty in her bones. By November 20th, the tunnel was finished. She had rigged a line of battery-powered LED work lights along the wooden ceiling, wired to a marine deep-cycle battery in the mudroom. On the evening of November 24th, the barometric pressure in the cabin plummeted to 980 millibars. The wind shifted, howling down from the peaks, carrying the scent of ozone and ice. Abigail stood on her back porch, looking at the heavy, reinforced storm door she had installed to seal the entrance of her tunnel. The sky above was no longer blue or grey. It was the color of a bruised plum. The winter hadn't just arrived. It had come to collect. The storm did not begin with a gentle flurry. It hit with the concussive force of an explosion. At 2 a.m. on November 25th, Abigail was jolted awake by a sound like a freight train screaming over the cabin's roof. The wind was registering sustained speeds of 60 miles per hour, with gusts tearing through the lodgepole pines at over 80. The temperature plunged from a manageable 20 degrees to -15 Fahrenheit in less than 3 hours. When she flipped the light switch in her bedroom, nothing happened. The power grid had failed almost immediately. Operating entirely by the beam of a heavy mag light, Abigail moved through the freezing cabin. She sparked the kindling in her cast-iron wood stove, the fire catching quickly and casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. Outside the double-paned windows, there was no yard, no trees, no world, only a dizzying, horizontal wall of violent white. The snow wasn't falling. It was being driven like shrapnel. By 8 a.m., the snow had drifted up to the windowsills. By noon, the windows on the north face of the cabin were entirely blacked out by a 12-foot drift. It was time to check the barn. Abigail dressed in expedition-grade gear, thermal base layers, wool sweaters, a down parka, and heavily insulated muck boots. She stepped into the mudroom, her heart hammering against her ribs, and unlatched the heavy wooden door leading into her constructed tunnel. As she stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her, the roar of the storm was instantly muted, reduced to a heavy, distant groaning. It was completely pitch black. She reached out, found the toggle switch on the wall, and flicked it. The string of LED work lights hummed to life, casting a harsh, pale glow down the 150-foot corridor of earth and timber. The air inside was shockingly cold, smelling intensely of raw pine sap, disturbed soil, and damp stone. But there was no wind. It was completely still. Abigail began the walk, The ground was uneven, the trench floor compacted by her boots, but still rough. Every few feet, she glanced up at the ceiling joists. The silence of the tunnel was eerie, contrasted only by the terrifying realization of what was happening directly above her head. It took her 2 minutes to reach the far end. She unbolted the secondary door that cut through the barn's foundation. As she stepped into the cavernous space of the barn, she was greeted by the nervous, high-pitched bleating of the goats and the heavy, rhythmic stomping of Samson in his stall. The barn was freezing, the wind rattling the massive sliding doors at the front of the structure, but it was dry. She spent an hour breaking ice in their water troughs, doling out heavy rations of alfalfa and grain, and soothing the terrified animals. The tunnel had worked. She had bypassed the deadly whiteout entirely. But nature, Abigail would soon learn, does not like to be cheated. The storm did not break. It raged continuously for 3 agonizing days and nights. According to Abigail's battery-operated emergency radio, the region was experiencing a once-in-a-century blizzard event. Entire towns were cut off. The National Guard had been mobilized, but grounded due to zero visibility conditions. Accumulation on flat ground was approaching 8 feet, with drifts measured in the tens of feet. On the afternoon of day 4, the math began to turn against her. Snow is heavy. Light, fluffy powder weighs about 4 pounds per cubic foot. But wind-packed, wet snow, the kind generated by the atmospheric river currently pounding the mountains, can weigh upward of 20 pounds per cubic foot. Abigail was sitting by the wood stove, drinking a cup of pine needle tea, when she felt it. A deep, resonant vibration traveled through the floorboards of the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It felt structural. She grabbed her flashlight and hurried to the mudroom, throwing open the tunnel door. The LED lights were still shining, but the geometry of the tunnel had changed. About 70 feet down, directly in the middle of the yard where the snow drifted the deepest, the ceiling was visibly bowing. Abigail's breath hitched. She jogged down the dirt corridor, the beam of her flashlight bouncing frantically. When she reached the midpoint, she stopped dead in her tracks. The half-inch CDX plywood was splintering. The heavy pressure-treated joists, rated for incredible loads, were groaning audibly. A horrifying sound, like a wooden ship breaking apart in heavy seas. A fine dust of dirt and frost was raining down from the ceiling. Above this specific section lay an estimated 15 feet of dense, packed snow. That was roughly 300 pounds of pressure per square foot pressing down on her makeshift roof. Crack. A sound like a rifle shot echoed through the confined space. One of the 2x6 joists snapped clean through, the wood jagged and white like a compound fracture. The corrugated steel above it instantly sagged, accompanied by a horrifying slump of heavy earth. Abigail didn't freeze. Her pragmatism overrode her panic. She sprinted to the barn, grabbed a heavy 8-ton hydraulic bottle, jack she used for the tractor, and dragged a heavy 6x6 timber post from Thomas's old lumber pile. Panting, sweat freezing to her face, she hauled the heavy equipment back into the tunnel. She positioned the timber vertically beneath the sagging steel, kicked the bottle jack under it, and began to pump the handle. Shh, clack. Shh, clack. The hydraulic arm rose, biting into the bottom of the timber, forcing it upward against the failing ceiling. The metal groaned in protest, but the sagging stopped. She had created a temporary shore. She leaned against the cold dirt wall, her lungs burning, trying to catch her breath. "Okay," she whispered into the dark. "Okay, it holds." But the tunnel wasn't the only thing bearing the weight of the sky. As Abigail stood in the suffocating silence of the corridor, a massive, catastrophic roar erupted from the direction of the barn. It sounded as though a freight train had crashed directly into the timber frame. The ground shook so violently that Abigail was thrown to her knees in the dirt, her flashlight skittering away. A blast of sub-zero air and a localized blizzard of white powder suddenly roared through the open barn door at the end of the tunnel, plunging the corridor into a violent, freezing wind tunnel. She scrambled on her hands and knees, grabbing her flashlight and forcing her way against the sudden wind into the barn. The sight stole the breath from her lungs. The immense weight of the snow on the steep pitch of the barn roof had finally given way. Thousands of pounds of packed snow had avalanched down the side of the structure, but the sheer volume had nowhere to go. The avalanche had slammed directly into the massive sliding wooden front doors of the barn, blowing them completely off their iron tracks and shattering them inward like toothpicks. The barn was fully breached. A wall of snow 15 feet high was currently spilling into the center aisle. The temperature inside the barn was equalizing, with the deadly negative 20 degrees outside. Bessie, Clara, and Dot were screaming, a terrifying, human-like sound that goats make when they believe they are going to die. Samson was kicking violently at his stall door, his eyes rolling white with panic. Abigail realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that the barn was lost. Within hours, the animals would freeze to death. There was only one option left. She had to evacuate the livestock. She had to bring a 1,000-pound draft mule, 3 panicked goats, and a flock of chickens through a 150-foot dirt tunnel that was currently held up by a single hydraulic jack back into her tiny residential cabin. And as she ran toward Samson's stall to grab his halter, the battery-powered LED lights strung through the tunnel suddenly flickered, buzzed violently, and died, plunging her, the terrified animals, and the groaning, failing earth into absolute darkness. Absolute darkness in a blizzard does not feel empty. It feels heavy, as if the cold itself has a physical mass pressing against your eyes. When the tunnel lights shorted out, Abigail Foster was completely submerged in that suffocating weight. The roaring wind funneling through the shattered barn doors carried a blinding spray of ice crystals. The sound was deafening, a chaotic symphony of splintering wood from the collapsing roof, the frantic bleating of the goats, and the terrifying hollow thud of Samson's hooves battering his stall. Panic tasted like copper in Abigail's mouth. She forced herself to breathe, leaning against the frozen draft of the tunnel entrance. Fumbling blindly, she ripped off her thick gloves, her bare fingers sweeping the icy mud until they brushed the cold aluminum casing of her dropped maglite. She clicked the button. The harsh halogen beam sliced through the swirling snow, illuminating a disaster. The barn was a lost cause. The massive snowdrift that had breached the front doors was advancing like a slow-motion glacier, burying the tractor and hay bales. "All right," Abigail shouted, her voice swallowed instantly by the wind. "Everybody out!" She moved with frantic purpose. First, the chickens. She grabbed 2 heavy burlap grain sacks, snagging the Rhode Island Reds by their legs 2 at a time and shoving them inside. She ignored their squawking and the frantic flapping that sent dust swirling into the flashlight beam. Tying the sacks with baling twine, she hauled them to the tunnel entrance. Next were the goats. Bessie, Clara, and Dot were paralyzed by fear, their rectangular pupils wide in the harsh light. Abigail grabbed a nylon rope, fashioned quick slip knots, and looped them over the animals' horns, tying the 3 together in a tight line. Then came Samson. The draft mule stood 15 hands high and weighed nearly 1,200 pounds. His immense power was currently fueled by blind panic. As Abigail approached, he reared back, his hooves splintering the top rail of his gate. "Easy, old man," Abigail pleaded, her voice cracking. "I'm right here." She slipped into the stall, pressing against his sweat-slicked flank. Getting a panicked mule into a dark, claustrophobic dirt tunnel seemed physically impossible. If he balked or kicked the structural supports, he would bring the ceiling down on top of them. Abigail unwrapped the thick wool scarf from her neck. Moving slowly, she draped the scarf over Samson's eyes, tucking the ends tightly into his leather halter to create a makeshift blindfold. The sudden darkness calmed him slightly, his frantic dancing slowing to a heavy shifting of weight. She clipped a lead rope to his halter. "Come on," she whispered, pulling firmly. "Trust me." She dragged the sacks of chickens into the mouth of the tunnel, holding the goat's rope in her left hand and Samson's lead in her right. She clamped the maglite under her armpit, angling the beam forward. The procession entered the earth. The tunnel was a nightmare. Without the LED lights, shadows danced menacingly against the raw dirt walls. The air pressure was completely wrong. The wind from the breached barn howled into the passage, pushing against their backs. Abigail walked backward, shining the light on Samson's blindfolded face, keeping agonizing tension on his lead. Because the tunnel was only 5.5 feet high, Samson had to lower his massive head, ears scraping the ceiling joists. The goats balked at every step, requiring Abigail to physically drag them through the loose dirt. 30 feet in, 50 feet. The silence of the earth was gone, replaced by the terrifying auditory feedback of the tunnel dying. The pressure-treated wood above them screamed. Dust and clumps of frozen soil rained down constantly. They reached the 70-foot mark. The beam illuminated the 6x6 timber post and the hydraulic bottle Jack Abigail had installed. The corrugated steel ceiling above it was bowed deeply, groaning with a sickening, wet sound. The passage was narrow here. Abigail squeezed past the jack, hauling the goats. Then she pulled Samson. The blindfolded mule stepped hesitantly. His massive shoulder brushed against the vertical timber post. Abigail stopped breathing. The timber shuddered. The bottle jack let out a sharp metallic ping. Above them, a 2x6 joist splintered. "Don't stop, Samson! Move!" Abigail screamed, hauling on the lead rope with every ounce of strength. The mule surged forward, hooves digging into the trench floor. They cleared the support jack just as the earth behind them gave way. It wasn't a sudden crash. It was a heavy, suffocating collapse. Tons of snow, ice, and earth violently sheared off its supports and crashed into the trench, instantly sealing off the route to the barn. The concussion threw Abigail onto her knees, the goats scrambling over her back. The maglite hit the dirt, the beam spinning before coming to rest. The wind from the barn was instantly cut off. The air went deathly still, thick with choking dust. They were sealed in. Abigail coughed violently, scrambling to find the flashlight. She swept the beam over the animals. Samson was trembling but standing still. The goats were tangled in their ropes. "We're okay," Abigail rasped. She looked back at the wall of collapsed earth. If they had been 10 seconds slower, they would be dead. She turned the beam forward. They had 50 feet left. The rest of the journey was a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. The air grew stale rapidly. Every creak of the wood sent spikes of terror through her nervous system. She dragged and cajoled the animals forward until the beam finally struck the heavy, reinforced storm door of her cabin's mudroom. Sobbing with relief, Abigail threw the deadbolt, hauled the door open, and dragged her menagerie into the warmth of the house. When Abigail slammed the heavy mudroom door shut and threw the interior iron deadbolts, sealing them off from the collapsed tunnel, the silence of the cabin felt absolute. She collapsed against the wooden door, her chest heaving, her legs turning to liquid. The maglite rolled across the linoleum floor. In the dim, flickering light of the wood stove spilling over from the living room, the scene was entirely surreal. Her meticulously kept, cedar-lined home had instantly transformed into a livestock pen. The 2 burlap sacks on the floor were writhing and clucking indignantly. Bessie, Clara, and Dot were huddled tightly against the washing machine, shivering and leaving a trail of muddy hoofprints. And standing dead center in the hallway, his massive head nearly touching the vintage glass chandelier, was Samson. The mule let out a long, shuddering exhale, the sheer volume of his breath fogging the hallway mirror. Abigail pulled the blindfold from his eyes. He blinked in the dim light, looking around the domestic space with a mixture of confusion and profound relief. The immediate danger was over, but the reality of the situation rapidly set in. The blizzard outside was still raging with catastrophic force. The power was dead, and Abigail was now trapped in a 900-square-foot cabin with 4 highly stressed farm animals, a flock of chickens, and no ventilation. Survival shifted from a sprint to a grueling, bizarre marathon. The first night was a masterclass in chaos. Abigail moved her heavy oak dining table against the far wall of the living room, effectively using her couches to barricade Samson into a designated corner. She laid down 3 layers of thick canvas tarps and emptied a bag of wood shavings she kept for the stove over the floorboards. The goats were corralled into the guest bathroom, their hooves clicking sharply against the tile. The chickens were released from their sacks into a large cardboard appliance box in the kitchen. By day 2, the temperature outside hit negative 30 degrees. Inside, the wood stove kept the cabin at a survivable 50 degrees, but the atmosphere was becoming intolerable. The biological reality of housing a 1,200-pound draft animal indoors could not be ignored. The smell of ammonia, wet fur, and manure was suffocating. The humidity from the animal's breath condensed on the freezing window panes, turning into thick sheets of solid ice on the inside of the glass. Abigail operated in a state of numb exhaustion. She hauled buckets of snow in from a cracked front window, melting it on the wood stove to provide drinking water for the animals. She rationed the 2 bales of emergency hay she kept in the mudroom, feeding Samson from her good ceramic serving bowls. At night, she slept fitfully in an armchair next to the fire, a loaded .30-30 rifle across her lap, not for the animals, but because the hunger of the deep winter often drove desperate mountain lions down from the peaks, and the smell of her cabin was radiating a beacon for miles. For 5 agonizing days, the cabin was a pressurized capsule of survival. Samson chewed the armrest of her favorite recliner to shreds out of anxiety. The goats managed to eat an entire aloe vera plant, pot and all. But they were alive. On the morning of December 1st, day 8 of the ordeal, Abigail woke to a strange, unfamiliar sensation. Stillness. The relentless, battering roar of the wind against the log walls had stopped. The wood frame of the cabin was no longer vibrating. Abigail painfully uncurled from her armchair, her joints stiff and aching. She walked to the front door and opened the small viewing grate. A solid, blinding wall of white, packed perfectly against the glass, greeted her. They were completely buried. She spent the next 3 hours systematically breaking through a second-story loft window. When she finally pushed the glass open and thrust her head outside, the brutal, blinding glare of the Montana sun nearly blinded her. The landscape was unrecognizable. The world had been smoothed over into a rolling ocean of glaring white. The trees were bowed over, heavily laden with snow. Of the barn, there was absolutely no sign. Just a massive, smooth hump of snow where the structure used to be. The tunnel she had dug was completely invisible, erased by the storm. It was mid-afternoon when she heard the heavy mechanical grinding of a diesel engine. A massive yellow county snowcat, its tracks churning through the 8-foot drifts, was slowly cresting the ridge of her driveway. Standing in the passenger basket, bundled in heavy orange survival gear, was her neighbor, Warren Hayes, alongside a county emergency responder named David Callahan. As the snowcat reached the perimeter of her house, David killed the engine. The silence rang in the crisp air. Warren stared at the buried cabin, his face grim. They had been digging out properties all morning, and the casualty rate for livestock and isolated residents was catastrophic. "The chimney's clear, but there's no smoke," David yelled, unhooking a heavy avalanche shovel from the side of the machine. "Let's dig down to the door. Prepare yourself, Warren. Nobody could have kept the fire going this long without going out for wood." They spent 40 minutes shoveling a trench down to Abigail's front porch. As Warren thrust his shovel toward the heavy wooden door, the deadbolt suddenly clicked. The door swung inward. Warren stepped back, startled. Abigail stood in the doorway, her face smeared with soot, her hair a tangled mess, looking thinner and older than he had ever seen her. "Abby," Warren breathed, dropping his shovel. "My God." We saw the barn was completely flattened from the ridge. We thought you went out there." Abigail offered a weak, exhausted smile. "I didn't have to, Warren. I took the tunnel." David Callahan stepped forward, peering over Warren's shoulder into the dim interior of the cabin. He stopped dead, his jaw dropping open. Standing in the center of the living room, placidly chewing on the remnants of a couch cushion, was Samson. The 3 goats poked their heads out from the bathroom hallway, bleating at the rush of fresh, cold air. "Holy hell," David muttered, pulling off his polarized sunglasses. "You brought the farm inside." "I brought my family inside," Abigail corrected gently, leaning against the doorframe. She looked out at the blinding, frozen wasteland that had tried to claim them, and took a long, deep breath of the freezing, pristine air. The tunnel didn't hold, but it held just long enough. Abigail Foster didn't just survive the historic blizzard, she out-engineered it. Her tunnel, though collapsed and ruined, bought her the critical minutes needed to cheat death. Today, a new, heavily reinforced above-ground covered walkway connects her cabin to the rebuilt barn. Locals no longer question her preparations. In the Bitterroot Mountains, nature sets the rules, but Abigail proved that human stubbornness can occasionally rewrite the ending.